There's a running gag in the Warhammer 40k painting community that says you never paint a yellow Space Marine, and the same goes for orange. Apparently, yellows and oranges are famously bad, in terms of acrylic paints anyway. I'm not talking about oils, I'm not talking about contrast paints, I'm just talking about acrylics. Since I use mostly Army Painter acrylics, I've run across kind of a similar problem with the yellow paints that I have had to use. They have pretty horrible coverage, they look pretty gross, and I've had to find some alternatives. And so that's what this video is about. Welcome to Your Average Bear Gaming. I am George. Today we're going to test yellow and orange acrylic paints. We're going to pit these against each other in a no-holds-barred contest and see which one comes up as a winner, or at least the less bad. Let's give it a shot, shall we? So I kept hearing that painting models orange or yellow is pretty challenging, and to some extent I agreed, but I haven't put it to a systematic test, and that's what this video is all about. So the basic idea is to test them out, right? So I have paints from 3 different lines, and I'm going to test them kind of side by side to see what their coverage looks like, and make a determination whether or not these are in fact as bad as I hear they are. I do have personal experience with one line, and at least for orange, it's not very good. But maybe I've been using it wrong. So I'm going to use it along with other 2 in the same exact way. Since we need some kind of models to test these paints on, I picked something that's been hanging around my collection that I've never gotten around to, but it'll be perfect, I think, for this particular test, and that's these guys. Adaptus Titanicus Questoris Knights. We're a pretty fun build, lots of little pieces end up in a really cool looking model. In spite of how cool they look, I probably won't ever use them for anything but a display piece, and since I'm about to test some paints on them, I may not even use them for that, but they're a great platform from what I'm about to do. So, I've got 3, and I've labeled them A, B, and C. Those 3 letters correspond to A, Army Painter, B, Huge Minis, and C, Citadel Color. Army Painter, Huge Minis, and Citadel Color. And for the yellow, I've got Army Painter, Huge Minis, and Citadel Color. I will point out that in both of these cases, there are a number of shades available. For example, in the yellow, there's this guy, Demonic Yellow, but there's also this guy, Moondust. I went with the yellow that's less light, so I figure a little darker color will give us a better chance at having decent coverage. I also limited it to the shades that I've got in my collection. In my case, I actually went out and bought this orange from a local friendly game store just because I needed it for the test. Can you imagine that? Buying a color you've heard is really, really bad just to test it out? That's weird, but it wasn't all that expensive, so that's fine. Since this test has to start somewhere, let's start with orange. Okay, I gave my paints a generous shaking. I'm going to start pouring some out onto my wet palette. Here we go. There's that much there, that much there. And because this guy is in a pot, I'll have to scoop some out. And I will be adding just a little bit of water to each of these. I'm going to try to make it the same amount. So, about so, about so, and about so. All right, now I'll give them a good swirl. Make sure the water is nice and incorporated. Clean the brush. Dry the brush. Swirl. Ugh, this is a little gloopy. This will probably need more water, but we'll just leave it as it is for testing purposes. Clean the brush. And mix it, mix. As you paint, you may use more or less water to thin down your paints, but we're going to treat them all equally here, just to make sure that they all have the chance to perform. So, let's start here with this Army Painter. And these are base coated in white. Actually, that doesn't look so bad. That actually doesn't look so bad. I don't know what I was complaining about. Maybe it's because I was trying to put it over other colors. I don't know. But it looks orange to me. It's a little transparent. But, you know, nothing another coat or two won't fix. Okay, let's try B next. This really does feel a lot thicker than Army Painter. Here is our huge minis. If I was using this in real life, I would have watered it down quite a bit more. It's fairly thick and gloopy, but as you can see, there's quite a bit more coverage. Also, it's a darn shame that they're not calling this Craft Dinner Orange as opposed to Nebula Orange. It really does look like Kraft Macaroni Dinner to me. Okay, Citadel color. I've never even used this paint before, but let's give it a shot. There it is, Citadel colors orange. It's pretty orange. Let's look at them side by side, shall we? Here are our three orange boys. And I've got Army Painter here, I've got Huge Minis here, and I've got Citadel color here. They're about the same shade of orange, but I can see a difference in coverage. Here is Army Painter's, and it's fine, but yeah, I can see quite a bit of the undercoat in there. And so it looks a lot like a glaze. Like a medium-bodied glaze. It's a kind of painting I would normally employ for a base coat. But I can kind of see where you'd run into some trouble with this paint. Yeah. Here is Huge Minis. And I'll be honest, it covers quite a bit better. But in my actual brushing experience, it's a lot gloopier. I think it needs more water to be a good example. But, you know, it's a side-by-side comparison, so I'm going to leave it as it is. It does cover better than Army Painter. What about Citadel color? This one also looks pretty decent to me. It doesn't look too bad. It probably covers about as well as Huge Minis, but it certainly covers better than Army Painter. So at least for this test on a white prime, I'd say these two are better than this one. Between these two, I don't know that I could choose. They look about the same. I think this test on white primer, we can conclude that Army Painter is probably the one that has the least coverage. So let's try this again, but this time with a black primer. Okay, let's start with The same test on orange paints, this time on black primed minis. So I have a new set of paint blobs because I want to make sure that they all have the same amount of water. Alright, I'll give this a good mix. And I have my A model right here. Yeah, so just looking at the consistency that's on the model, I can already tell that the Army Painter orange is acting quite a bit like a thin, maybe a medium-bodied glaze, but it's not offering a ton of coverage, and I suspect that in the past I have been using this as a full-strength paint by thinning it down the same way I would thin down any other paint, which means I would use a bit more water, and so I can see why my results have been as unsatisfactory as I have had them, because I think Army Painter's orange at least is just a much thinner paint than the other two. But let's get confirmation by actually painting with the other two. So I'll go next with Huge Minis Orange. And this one, just looking at the consistency of the paint that's on my palette, I can tell you it is significantly thicker, or at least it's clumpier than Army Painter's. Let's give these a coat. Yeah, and while this coat's perhaps a little bit better than Army Painter's, it's pretty streaky, and I think a paint like this probably would benefit from a flow improver. It doesn't look... It actually kind of looks worse than Army Painter's, but I can tell the coverage is better. It's better, but not in a great way, at least. With the Army Painter, if it's too thick, if it's too thin, I can always add another coat. This is doesn't have sufficient coverage, but it's also kind of clumpy. I don't know if I like that. Alright, let's test our Citadel paints. This is the paint that most of you will be more familiar with, probably. I don't know if that's true or not, but I suspect that most people painting Warhammer 40k minis are probably doing so with Citadel colors. And this orange seems to flow a little better. Certainly better than the Huge Minis. Alright, and there it is. Citadel colors orange. It kind of feels somewhere in between the two, Army Painter and Huge Minis, but it seems to cover a little bit better than both. I wasn't expecting that. Let's let these dry and take a look at them once they're not quite so shiny. Here are the three models. I'm going to try to guess which is which. I'm going to go with this is Army Painter, this is Huge Minis, and this is Citadel color. And I'm going to guess this is Army Painter because of the coverage. And so you can see here, it is orange, but there's lots of the undercoat still showing through. Yeah, that's probably needs a couple of coats to get that settled in. And yep, there is the A, it's Army Painter. So yeah, I can see where people would be frustrated with that. This one, I'm going to guess, is Huge Minis just because of the tone. It's a pretty vibrant orange compared to this guy, which is, I mean, they're pretty close, but there's a tinge more yellow here than there is here. And also, you can kind of see how spotty it is. It's kind of on the gross side. Yeah, there's B. There's Huge Minis, which leaves this guy as Citadel color. Yep, C. Yeah, it's fairly transparent. It's not quite as transparent as Army Painter, so it's a little better. But it did seem to flow better than Huge Minis acrylic paint. And again, I wonder if this is because it's a little thicker than I'm used to. So if I was using these in real life, I would probably thin this one down a little bit, but given the coverage problems it already has, I can see where thinning it down to make it flow a little better may actually be shooting myself in the foot. I end up with something like this. This one, well, it doesn't cover very well. At least it flows better. So yeah, either way, I'm not really pleased with the results. However, there is something that you could do. Let's say I was painting these for real. If I ended up here, I would give them a second coat to see if that would smooth things out. In fact, a second coat could even smooth out some of the kind of stickiness problems with this guy. So I'm going to give him a quick second coat and see if things are any better. And here they are. Not after a second coat of orange, but a third, count them, 3 coats of orange. Now, I've only hit the pauldrons because I wanted you to be able to see the difference between the 3 coats and the single coat. And we can still see that this guy is likely our Army Painter, this guy is likely our Huge Minis, and this guy is likely our Citadel color. A, B, and C. So, as similar as they are, they can still be readily identified, at least, honestly, these two. This orange is very distinct. The Citadel color is just by deduction. Since I know what these two are, I know what this one must be. So after 3 coats, we can see that it certainly did help. There's a bit more opacity on the pauldrons than there are in the single coat in the middle of the carapace, I guess. But it's still fairly transparent. You probably need a couple of coats to get this to work well. In the past, when I have used this orange, I've had to, before I lay down the first coat of orange, I have to prepare the surface with like an off-white, like a skeleton bone or a bone white, something like that. And even then, it's still fairly transparent. It takes me a couple of coats to get it to where I need it to be. And even then, it doesn't seem to get there. It's just too thin or too transparent. So there it is. The other thing I can say is that black seems to be very challenging as an undercoat for these paints. Here are the results for the Huge Miniatures paint. And yep, there's a bit more opacity there, just as with the previous one. And we can see that, the pauldron compared to the central carapace. This one's a bit closer, but it's still a little patchy. I'm starting to think that water isn't the way to go with this paint. I think maybe it's going to require water and flow improver, because there is quite a bit of patchiness there. And finally, we have Citadel Colors Orange. It is a lot like the other 3. The 3 coats certainly seems to help, but there is still some fairly significant transparency. But it does do better than the single coat, obviously, but it still has a ways to go. Of the 3, I think maybe Huge Miniatures has a bit of an advantage in terms of giving this opacity, but it's not by a lot, and it's offset by this weird patchiness, the texture of the paint. So with that done, looks like we have a pretty good idea of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these 3 paints. I can't say that any of them are fantastic. They all bring something different to the table. But in terms of opacity, I think Army Painters is a clear loser. That sounds harsh. I don't mean it to be that harsh. It's just not as good at coverage as these other 2. And It's tough really to say between these two which one I would prefer. I would say probably they're about the same. Now with the huge minis, we still have to grapple with that texture issue, but we were here examining opacity. So RB Painter's Lava Orange didn't do the job I was hoping, and these two did an okay job. They could have done better, but honestly, they're about as good as they're going to get. I don't know if other paint brands can do better. Vallejo, Scale 76 or whatever. There's a bunch of other brands out there that I don't have my hands on. So maybe there's a better orange to be had out there. If you do know if there's a better orange to be had out there, let me know. I'd be really interested in finding out. Now, let's tackle the yellow. And for yellow, I have Demonic Yellow, Uriel Yellow from Citadel Color. It's in my own bottle. And from Huge Minis, we have this guy. It's called Sun Orange, but it looks yellow to me. This one's a little lighter, but it's about equivalent to this guy. And to do that, I've got to reprime these again. Alright, let's start with the yellow test. Got some Army Painter here. Since I have a slightly larger glob, I'm going to add a little bit more water, just to keep them a little shy of 50-50, with there being a little bit more paint than there is water. This is Army Painter. And here we go. Okay, that's what that looks like right there. Next is Huge Minis. Gonna try to give this a nice, good mixing. I don't know if you can see it on camera there, but there's a lot of globs here. That's pretty consistent with these paints. With just a little bit of experience I have with them. I've had one other project where I've used them, and they're all kind of globby like this. Don't know if that's because they're brand new, I haven't mixed them well enough, I'm not sure. Yikes, that looks kind of streaky. Oof, okay. Alright, we're going to do Citadel Color. And there we are with Citadel Color. Nice flow. Okay coverage, I guess. But this is a black primer. It's the hardest challenge I think these paints are going to get. So let's let them dry and see what they look like once that happens. Alright, here are my yellow boys. And the single coat is dry, and this is actually a lot closer than I expected. I think this is the Army Painter. Right here, it's a little less opaque than the others, but actually I think it did better than the orange. It's not too bad. I bet it'll get a little better with some additional coats. This guy right here is the Huge Minis, and it is more opaque, but it's really streaky. Hoping that another coat or two will help that out, but yeah, there's clearly something I'm missing with the Huge Minis paint, because it's clumpy and all kinds of weird, and I don't like the way that looks at all. And here is, I'm pretty sure, Citadel paints. Yeah, Citadel. So here is Army Painter, and here is Citadel. So yeah, you can kind of tell that Citadel is a little less transparent than Army Painter, but there's a little bit of that streak happening here as well. So Citadel color is kind of in between these. Yeah, honestly, I think I like Army Painter's yellow best, better than these two, just because it's, even if it's fairly transparent, it's at least consistent. This stuff is grainy. This stuff is also a little janky. But let's give it at least another coat, maybe two, and see how they look afterwards. After 3 coats on the pauldrons, anyway, here are my yellow boys. Let's guess here. I'm going to go with, this is Army Painter. This is Huge Minis, and this is Citadel Color. Army Painter, there's an A. Huge Minis, there's a B, and Citadel Color. I was able to tell these apart more by their color than the opacity, because after 3 coats on the pauldrons, it's getting better. It's not perfect, but I think they're approaching decent coverage. So let's talk about Army Painter right here. Even after the second coat, this one was looking pretty okay. But the third coat really kind of cemented it in. I mean, you can still see a bit of the undercoat, but you can kind of tell the difference between the pauldron and the carapace. There's quite a bit of difference there. So additional coats absolutely helps. Eventually, with enough coats, you're going to get full opacity if that's what you're shooting for. With Huge Minis, I don't know. It's not great. There's still a lot of this streakiness that I don't like. This side there's less streakiness, and so you can kind of see that there's some decent coverage there after 3 coats. So it's okay, but I think I like Army Painter's results better. And here is Citadel Color. I think it's probably the best result, but it's all pretty comparable, I think, to Army Painter. I think the only real difference is the hue or the shade value. I don't know. This is a brighter yellow. This is a more orangey yellow. But in terms of opacity, actually, I think Army Painter takes it after the 3rd coat relative to Citadel Color. But it's fairly close. That's fairly close. So that's what these guys will look like after 3 coats of yellow over black primer. Alright, I've reprimed my trusty little Quastor Knights for their last test. This is quite a few coats of primer and quite a few coats of paint. And I don't know if you can tell, but the details are getting quite a bit softer on these pauldrons. There is this idea that you can paint and repaint your models without stripping the paint, and you won't have to worry about losing detail. That never really made sense to me. Certainly for 2, maybe 3 attempts, you'd probably be okay, but at some point you do accumulate enough layers of paint that the details start getting softer. But that's okay. These models were never really meant to be painted for real. They're just my tests. Let's try this again. We'll start with Army Painter. Alright. We'll let them dry and see what they look like. Alright, here they are after they've dried, and from kind of far away, they don't look so bad. You know, they're clearly yellow, they're nice and bright, but we start having issues when we start looking at them kind of closely. I'll start with, let's see, this one's Army Painter. I'm going to go with this one being Huge Minis, and then this one being Citadel. Army Painter, Huge Minis, and Citadel Color. Okay, good. And so the reason I can tell is because, for Army Painter at least, the shade of yellow is kind of a brighter, more yellowy yellow. There's a little bit more orange in these other 2, but the coverage doesn't look too bad, at least over this white undercoat, which is kind of resonating with me. It looks like a lot of the success of these paints in particular is down to the undercoat. And so even though that it might be just as transparent as on the black, you really can't tell because of the white undertone. So this doesn't look half bad. It looks pretty yellow, and it's not very patchy. It looks fairly opaque. At least I can't tell, where the patchiness is. So, you know what? I think Army Painter may win this round. If we look at the huge minis, we can see how these are different, particularly with the patchiness. There is quite a bit of streaking on this one. So the parts where it does cover, it covers well, but there is a streakiness that we have noticed in not only the orange but also with the black undercoat. So that seems to be part of the issue here that we have to solve with huge minis. And this is Citadel color, and oddly enough, this was kind of in between. It's not as patchy as huge minis, but it doesn't seem to cover as well. It's a little less. It's more patchy than Army Painter, but not as patchy as huge minis, which is kind of a weird thing. So, since I know that patchiness is something that could be due to my brushstroke technique, let's give these at least another coat and see what they look like after that. And here they are after 3 coats. I'll arrange them in the colors I believe they are. So there we have it. And they all look quite a bit better. Here, let me look at them real quick. Yeah, they all look quite a bit better after 3 coats. But I'm pretty sure this is Army Painter. Yep, that's an A. I'm pretty sure this is Huge Minis. That's B, which makes this a Citadel. And again, I've determined which ones they were based on the color, although the colors for these two are pretty close, but this still has this Cheeto-y macaroni craft dinner quality to it that it keeps jumping out at me, and I keep identifying it as huge minis. The hue itself isn't a bad thing. It's just different from what I'm used to, although it's pretty close to this guy. Army Painter continues to be the lightest, most vibrant, yellowy one of them all. And so the patchiness is gone from all 3 models for the most part. And here's the results for Army Painter. The patchiness is pretty much gone, although all these coats on my model has left the details really soft. I don't like the way that looks, but that's not what this video is about. This is about what these different paints look like, and so yeah, we've arrived at a pretty vibrant yellow. Here with Huge Minis, we have sort of the same thing. It's got a touch of orange. I don't know if it'll make it to the camera, but there is still a little bit of patchiness to this one, but it's not a ton. It's not very obvious, although if the undercoat was black, you could probably still see it. And here we are with Citadel. Yeah, I don't see any of the patchiness that I would see with huge miniatures. Yeah, it looks like the 3rd coat did a pretty decent job with the coverage. This is an interesting finding I wasn't expecting. If you look at the difference between these 2 models, here we have Citadel, here we have Huge Minis. Look at the detail on Huge Minis. They have the same number of coats, both primer and paint, and the details are sharper with Huge Minis. I don't know what that means. If I look at it from the other side, we see the same thing. So I don't know if that means the Huge Minis is thinner. I mean, it must suggest that. But in working with these on my wet palette, it looks like it's actually thicker and gloopier. If we compare the same thing with Army Painter, there's a little bit of a less difference, but I can still see the details for Huge Minis are sharper than the Army Painter. So I don't know really what's going on. But ultimately, with enough coats over a white primer, you can get a pretty decent yellow. refreshing. Yeah, don't do that. This is not Sunny Delight. This is paint water. So, what have we learned after all this incessant painting and drying and repriming? I guess there's a couple of takeaways. I think the first one is probably the most obvious. If you're going to use yellow or orange, avoid putting these colors directly on black undercoats. It seems obvious, but a lot of people like to prime their models black, and then they want to go ahead and add, like a yellow or an orange, either a base coat or some details, and that's going to make your life a little difficult. It's a good idea to undercoat, prepare those surfaces with something like a white. Or like a bone white or something like that. Ideally, with a spray can or an airbrush, if you have that handy. Otherwise, you have to brush that on, and white has problems of its own. That's my understanding in terms of coverage. So, working with these colors can be a challenge, at least compared to others, but there are ways around it. Between the yellow and the orange, I think I'm more happy with the yellows. The orange still, whether they were white or black undercoats, I still had patchiness there at the end. I don't know what that means necessarily, but yellow is slightly easier to work with than the oranges, at least from the manufacturers that I used in this video. And finally, across the three brands, a couple of things that I've kind of learned. One of them is Army Painter is, at least for these colors, it does have less coverage. Even with very little thinning, the paints feel like a glaze, which may not be a bad thing, but it can be if that's really not what you're looking for. If you want to get a solid opaque yellow or orange, you're going to have a challenging time. You're going to have to build up a number of coats, and that can be less than ideal for your painting project and your sanity. Citadel color seems to be a pretty good middle of the road. It has decent coverage, has decent texture, and it isn't overly patchy across both the orange and the yellow. If you're looking for something that'll do the job most of the time with kind of less work than Army Painter, Citadel color might be the way to go. As for huge minis, I don't know. I clearly have to work with the paint brand a little bit more. I had high hopes, and I have used it in another project, and they work fine. But for these colors, it was a little challenging to work with these paints. I haven't yet mixed in any flow improver into these paints, and I think that's going to be my very next thing, is to experiment with these a little bit more, because they show solid promise. But they are, they're new to the game, and so maybe they have some kinks to work out, or maybe they're just a little bit different, and a little bit of extra care will really bring out their strengths. So overall conclusions: Army Painter, a little thin, but not impossible to use. Citadel color, it'll work well for most of your needs. Well, anyway, for these colors. They have decent coverage, they have decent texture, they're relatively easy to use, and you probably already have these in your collection. As for huge minis, the jury is still out. I have some further experimenting to do with these guys before I could recommend them, or before I could say, now these are not going to be better than what you probably already have. So for right now, I wouldn't rush out to buy these. Generally speaking, they're very comparable to Citadel color paints. They might cover a little bit better, but they have this disadvantage of having this weird texture that's going to give you kind of a bad time. They cover a little bit better than Army Painter, but I don't know that it's worth replacing your current line of Army Painter, or at least these two colors for Army Painter. So for now, what you have in your collection, if you already have an orange and you already have a yellow, it probably will continue to work. There are differences across the brands, but they're not really that significant, at least not yet. So don't rush out and replace what you've got. Having said that, it is not impossible to paint your models orange and yellow. There's a couple of tricks to it. You can get the job done. You just have to tweak your approach a little bit, and you can get yellow and orange models in your collection. Having said all that, I want to thank you very much for tuning in to Your Average Bear Gaming. I hope you've learned something, and if you had, please do me a favor and click on that subscribe button or just the like button or leave me a comment. Any of those things help. All three will work better. Have a wonderful afternoon. Be nice to yourselves and each other.